All right, welcome everybody. Those of you who are joining us on Zoom, welcome. This is we have a talk today from Dr. Zohar Lederman. He is a doctor, physician, and a bioethicist. Recently came here from Haifa in Israel and is now in the HKU Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit. And he is going to talk to us today about loneliness. So all of you lovers out there sitting by yourself by the computer, this one's for you.
Thank you. Well, can I make sure first that everybody can hear me well? Among our audience far away?
They're using this so they can,
Okay.
it picks it up pretty well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so if anybody cannot hear me, just speak out. So what I thought about doing, just because loneliness is really, as a topic, it covers a lot of subtopics. I see something in chat. So starting from more philosophical considerations, like deep theoretical consideration, all the way to more practical implications in clinical medicine, so what we call the bedside. What I was thinking is to talk in general about loneliness for maybe like 20 minutes, and then stop there, see if there are any questions, and see whether there's any preferred direction that we want to go into. Obviously, because this is a philosophy department, the talk should be more philosophical. So because I saw that everybody here basically is interested in AI, so I was thinking to go into more in depth into loneliness and technology, or technological solutions to loneliness, specifically focusing on social robots. So I have a bunch of nice videos on that, but we can talk about other stuff that I've been either working on or plan to work on in the future. So just to start with a general description of loneliness and what motivates this project in the first place. So my interest in loneliness started obviously during, even prior to COVID, actually. So as an emergency medicine physician, we used to get a lot of patients who, even though they were discharged to go home from the emergency department, they stayed, right? And they stayed simply because they had nowhere to go. They have no home, really, or they had nobody to go back to at home. And that is true to those who have a relationship, they have families or not, right? During COVID, it got even more extreme, as I had several patients who actually committed suicide because of quarantine, because of lockdowns, because their families stopped visiting them. Okay, so that kind of motivated my interest in loneliness. And then I started looking at it more deeply. And then I noticed that why loneliness was a big topic among philosophers of mind and among public health people and among artists. It got really little attention by ethicists and by medical ethicists, really almost nothing. Again, so that was a nice gap for me to kind of delve into. So really, why deal with loneliness is really, I think, this person, the lonely patient who is lonely, or who might feel sick because of loneliness, or partially because of loneliness. And I think anecdotally, because a lot of us have been or will be lonely in the future or in the past. More generally, why loneliness? Because loneliness is extremely common. So numbers. So the largest trial to date is the BBC trial, which was just published, and that shows 24%-ish among the elderly worldwide, with a large group, 55,000 people, with the largest group actually being the young adults, and the rates there are up to 40% worldwide. Okay, and you have at least 3 papers relating to Hong Kong that were done here in Hong Kong, and the numbers in Hong Kong are roughly 20% loneliness. In Hong Kong, you have a notion of the hidden elderly, right? So those are the elderly who actually nobody knows about them. They stay at home, play computer or watch movies, and nobody knows about them, and nobody takes care of them. So extremely, extremely common worldwide. In Israel, it's about 19% among young adults to 24% or 22% among the elderly. So that's one. Second is that loneliness is a huge public health concern because of these health implications. It's a huge risk factor, being up there with obesity, smoking. So we know it disturbs your sleep. We know it increases your blood pressure, decreases your immune system. We know it increases mortality, it increases cardiovascular diseases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another reason is that loneliness simply makes us, well, obviously it's a risk factor for suicide and depression, but regardless of those effects, loneliness just makes us sad. It reduces our well-being, and as philosophers, I think our main concern, or one of our main concerns, is the well-being of our fellow human beings. And lastly, I think loneliness goes very deep, and this is why it's interesting philosophically, among other reasons. Philosophers have, including one from California, argue for this notion of existential loneliness. There is something so deep that the need to escape, that we are lonely from the minute we are born, but we have a deep need to escape that. And Greek philosophers, at least since Aristotle, talked about how humans are social creatures and we depend on friendships, on companionships, to live this kind of a virtuous life. So loneliness really goes deep into the core and really hampers our core as human beings. In a way, it really limits our humanity, or limits ourselves from becoming what we can be and should be. So that's, in general, why we should think about loneliness. The literature, the philosophical literature, or the social science literature on loneliness usually deals with definitions of loneliness and kind of empirical stuff on loneliness. What I do in my research is to focus on the normative aspects of loneliness. But before we go into that, it's important to realize the definition, the various definitions of being alone, of aloneness, right? So usually authors distinguish between social isolation, right? Which is reflected obviously during COVID, in lockdowns, quarantine. Social isolation can definitely cause loneliness, but it doesn't have to. Okay, so you can distinguish, you can divide between social isolation and loneliness. The two are not necessarily linked. Okay, they are correlated, but not necessarily linked. So one can be lonely in the middle of New York City or in the middle of Hong Kong. and one can be lonely, or one can be not lonely, be happy and satisfied on the top of a mountain without anybody else, right? So that's social isolation, and that's more an objective definition rather than loneliness, which is more subjective. Solitude, on the other hand, is this notion of a positive experience of being alone. It's an instance where one is alone, but it's being productive, right? So when we later, if we talk about technology, so historians of loneliness talk about how the advent of newspapers allowed people to be in solitude while with others, right? While in society. So think about you reading the newspaper while you are surrounded by your family members. In a way, it's a way for humans to be in solitude, to be on their own, just to read, to think, while being surrounded by other people. And the same, in a way, goes to technology, that technology might be a way for us to be in solitude with ourselves, to be productive while with others. And obviously, this is the positive aspect of technology. There might be, and there are negative aspects of it. So solitude is kind of this positive experience of being alone. And usually we think about philosophers, we think about religious figures, you know, going back to the Bible, to Moses getting the Bible from God. They were all done in solitude, right? So philosophers like to mention this, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, right? Who grows and becomes a lion in the desert. So that's solitude. What I'm really concerned about is loneliness. And loneliness is the negative experience of being alone, right? I think all humans experience loneliness at some point of their life. What I'm focusing on and what public health people are focusing on is more chronic loneliness, right? So this is the persistent loneliness rather than, you know, there was one day where you felt lonely when you went abroad, right? So we're talking about a longer periods of time where you felt lonely because of in different contexts and for various reasons. And that loneliness in turn affects your health in negative ways and your well-being. Usually the common definition of loneliness is very operational, and I would say superficial for philosophers. And the definition is, and this is how social scientists talk about it since the 70s, that loneliness is a subjective distress caused by a mismatch between what you expect your social relations to be and what you perceive them to be, right? So you expect P, whether it be intimate relations or just friends, relationship with friends, or even with God, and P minus 1, if what you perceive is P minus 1, then you feel the distress of loneliness, right? So you don't get what you expect. That's that's the common operational definition of loneliness. Part of my research is to really examine or expand this notion of loneliness because, well, I think it would be intuitive for most of us in this room that definition is inadequate, or at least it's operationally it's fine and it's good for research and stuff, but it's not enough, right? So it doesn't explain why one can feel lonely in one instance while other will feel solitude, or just would feel the social isolation but not loneliness. Right? It doesn't explain why it is that a person will feel happy and content on top of a mountain and the other will feel lonely in that instance. And it doesn't account for the way such expectations arise, right? what brings about a certain expectation that you have from social relations, right? And the definition is very limited in what it can tell us about the normativity of loneliness, what we owe lonely people. So part of what I'm doing is to focus on, elaborate on various types of loneliness, and I detail some of them here. I just added, again, because of the context, I added theological loneliness because just in preparing for this talk, I came across two really fascinating and interesting and nuanced articles talking about this kind of loneliness as separation from God that people can experience, which I find, first of all, accurate and very intriguing from a philosophical point of view. How do I go from here to, okay. So that's why loneliness and what is loneliness. And I will end this first part talking a little bit about a human right against loneliness. So thinking about loneliness in normative terms, you can equate that to think about health in normative terms, right? So in bioethics and applied ethics, we usually talk about health normatively in the sense that those who are not healthy deserve to be healthy, right? They have a right to be healthy, or at least a right to healthcare, and that right means something. It means that others have duties to provide resources, provide opportunities for them to be healthy. A society that is that has people who are not healthy is a bad society, right? Or the more unhealthy people you have, the worse society is. I think about the US one. I think about loneliness along the same lines. Loneliness, because of the reasons that I provided before, loneliness should be considered as normative in the sense that because it's so against our essence as social creatures, because of its health effect, society should really be serious about amending, correcting, preventing loneliness, right? So if society is here to facilitate people advancement, right? So facilitate, to allow people to prosper, to live happily and contently, it should do something about loneliness. It should prevent or mitigate loneliness, because loneliness is a limiting factor. I think there are several ways to get to it, to get such a right. The easiest path, I think, from a philosophical perspective, is to talk about the right against loneliness, or the right not to be lonely, as part of a right to health, right? So again, because of the descriptive stuff that I said before, the link between loneliness and bad health, if you support a right to health, or at least a right to healthcare, then I think the distance between that and supporting a right against loneliness is short, right? Is pretty much straightforward. Again, so loneliness hampers your health, and if we are serious about a right to health, then we should do something about loneliness. And we can talk about it more, but basically there are internal conditions for loneliness and external conditions. So internally, you can think about having socialization classes, like in the UK, where you train people to be more social, right? And external conditions, you give resources to people to register for classes, for instance, to go to yoga classes, right? To take care of a dog, and all these kinds of give them all kinds of tools that we know might prevent or mitigate loneliness. So that's the easy path, philosophically speaking. more sophisticated but harder to justify path go deeper than that. And they will, and such accounts will argue that loneliness, or humans have a human or a basic or non-basic right against loneliness, regardless of the health outcome. So that means, or in 20 years, if we discover that loneliness, it's not true that loneliness is linked to all these health impacts, and in a way, it's a threat because the science is limited. So we know much more about social isolation than loneliness. And this kind of research is extremely hard to really prove eventually. But regardless of the empirical facts here, why should we, or why we should have a right against loneliness? And you can do that in two ways. You can go from up to bottom, or from bottom up. So from top to bottom, what authors have been doing, to talk in the sense of social determinants of health, for instance, or to describe some sort of theory of human well-being, where for the human well-being, you need to have, or for a theory of social justice, you have a few criteria, right? So health is a condition for well-being. Having a house, having a home is a condition for well-being. And you can say that having friends, or Nussbaum calls it the capability to play, that's a condition for well-being. So that's one way to go about it. Another way to go about it, which is, I think, the most demanding one, and that's what I'm currently engaging, but the least developed, is from bottom up, is to really go to the core of what I said earlier, what it is about being human, and why it is that social connections are so intrinsically important to our really being human, to our humanity. And I think that's the real challenge, but also that's what we should be arguing, because I actually think that's the accurate account, right? And this goes back to Aristotle again, who really, I think, was accurate in capturing that nobody can be happy, and I have his quote somewhere here, nobody can be happy without friends. Even the richest guy cannot be happy without friends. And so let me stop here, see if you have questions, mainly maybe for students, and then I can keep going.
Thank you. All right. We have a question right here. Yes, go ahead.
So I have a question that you said a person have a right not to be lonely, but how about a person is so evil that he cannot be with other people? So if this person is so evil that if he is be with the others will be harmed, then is that person still have the right to be not lonely?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very good point. So Kimberly Brownie, she's the only philosopher right now, well, until maybe a month ago, she was the only one who talked about loneliness as a normative, in normative terms. She's now in Canada, originally from the UK. And that's, so half of her book is devoted to answering your question. And she argues that yes. So even though you are obnoxious as a human being, and it's not fun to be around you, people still have the obligation to accommodate you to an extent. So people should still have a responsibility as members of a community to prevent you from being lonely. It is my sense, I agree with her to some extent. I think whatever, even if you establish a right to loneliness or against loneliness, it won't be an absolute right. There are no absolute rights, right? Even the right to life can be wavered or violated in some instances. And I think the right against loneliness can also be waived in some instances, for instance, when you harm other people, right? So that's one way to justify it. Say, you know what, no, I'm distancing myself from that person. But you can be more nuanced than that and more sophisticated than that. You can say, you know what, society, rather than individuals, have a duty to accommodate that right against loneliness. So that means that society should do something against you being obnoxious, right? So it should, maybe not you individually, but the society should devote more resources to prevent that from happening, to prevent from future people to be obnoxious, right? Or to make it, or to stigmatize it to a larger extent, you know, the way we stigmatize other negative traits. And this way to enable the right against loneliness.
It seems like that's part of the problem of being put in isolation in prison, right? Most prisoners are with the general population, often with a cellmate, and of course there are dangers and threats there. But when people are put in isolation, it's really torturous, really horrific for most people.
Yeah, I agree. So I actually wrote something about comparison, comparing social isolation, solitary confinement to force feeding. I think part of the reason why solitary confinement should never be allowed is because of that, because loneliness can be so destructive for folks that we should really ban it altogether.
I have a question. You mentioned that during the COVID period, we got all those lockdown things, and during quarantine, people suffer from loneliness and some of them suicide. I wonder, even if they are social isolated, they can still contact each other through social media. So why do they feel lonely?
Good question. So that's actually a good lead point to what I wanted to talk about, technology and loneliness. So, right. So during COVID, I think people started using more and more technological solutions to loneliness. And that includes, you know, Facebook, Twitter, and more. So virtual reality, social robots, and what have you. And there were some countries and municipalities, and I know of some in Israel, for instance, that actually provided computers to people, right? New York City just acquired 850 social robots to give to elderly as a assistance against loneliness, social isolation. I think the evidence on that, well, two things about that. First is the evidence of that is controversial, to say the least. So whether the use of technology is actually helpful in mitigating loneliness is controversial. One systematic review that I know, the Cochrane review, actually shows that Facebook makes people more lonely rather than mitigate the loneliness. Now, you are maybe referring to more kind of like the technology that mimics face-to-face more readily. So, you know, Zooming or Skyping. And I think people did that. I think it failed in many areas. Something, people were still missing something that technology could not provide. And, you know, in one of the articles that I sent out, I suggested it might be human touch or smell. Actually, I'm not convinced about the smell, but I'm pretty convinced about the touch. But obviously, there was something that technology could not capture. And we see that because people were still suffering from loneliness, and, you know, people were still complaining about loneliness. We see that COVID increased rates of loneliness. We still see that now. and people were still committing suicide. My patient, I had a patient who stopped eating for a week, just like that. And he could still communicate with his family, but something was not, he wasn't getting something that he needed from technology. So that's one answer. The second answer is, I think there is, and I can show you some clips if you want, there is something I think that is that really that is really bothering, or might really bother you when you realize that what society has to offer to lonely individuals is just throwing technology at them. Rather than providing more humane solution, rather than providing human contact, we just throw technology on, we throw computers on them. And I think intuitively it feels bad, especially I think for philosophers. There's something really that doesn't sit well with our intuitions.
So I think the missing things are not touchless now, because through AR we can still have those feelings, I guess. But I guess there is something missing, and that's something spiritual. Like we think about philosophical or religious things. I think that's what's missing.
Spiritual?
Spiritual things, like we think about philosophical questions or questions related to religion, all those spiritual things.
But how can you say more about how don't you get that from discussing with someone on Skype?
I guess that most people, they are not engaged in these topics. They only concerned about their basic lives, like eating, have fun, and they don't have concern for these spiritual questions. I think that's what made them feel anxious or lonely.
But how did COVID change? How did social isolation change? If what you're saying is true, then they would have felt lonely if they were not isolated, right? Or you're saying that these spiritual mechanisms provide protection against the loneliness that someone might feel during social isolation. So they believe in God, for instance.
Well, I think social isolation maybe don't have to do with the spiritual things.
Do you mean that there's something spiritual about being in others' presence, or do you mean something like being in a church in worship setting?
I don't think something being in church. I think it's just something they lack some spiritual things.
Okay. Yeah, I guess what we're struggling to understand is, so you can say that lacking spiritual protection, whether it believe in God or believe in philosophy, having philosophy as your God, is protective, and I think nobody will disagree with that. I guess what we are struggling to understand is, or what I'm struggling to understand is, so how did the fact that someone was socially isolated, so in that, what was the difference between being in social isolation and not, with what you're saying? So there's no sense of spiritual experience, or how did social isolation make it so that the spiritual mechanisms that you're describing, the spiritual traits that you're describing, that you're alluding to, were missing? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, with or without social isolation,
Yeah,
we will always lack these spiritual things.
right.
That's the problem of my argument.
Yeah, Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. I definitely agree with that. And so I think, again, this is one article that I found extremely, obviously I'm not a religious person, but I found it extremely sensible and accurate. I think we know from empirical literature, we know that believing in God is protective of loneliness, right? And all kinds of spirituality. It doesn't have to be believing in God, but or faith, but believing in God is one big protective mechanism. And because of that, I think society should really emphasize that, regardless of whether society sees itself as religious or not, since we are concerned about the well-being of people, and since we know that religious or faith is such a major component of humans' lives, society should really make more effort in promoting it, in enabling it, in using it as a protective mechanism against loneliness. And so this author, for instance, this was written a long time ago, but I think he's spot right. So, I brought his quote here. He talks about loneliness experienced by people who lost God, right? And again, I think it is spot on. And reading this, and I read this yesterday, I realized that one of the reasons why I stopped believing in God, because I come from almost a religious, half a religious house, was because I realized, the stuff that I expected, assuming that God existed, did not happen, right? Did not manifest. And that made me doubt the existence of God. And that realization or thinking that I realized that God doesn't exist can be extremely dangerous and can be a source of loneliness, right? Definitely. And then this is what happens, when the saying that God is dead, then you'll start looking for other meanings in life, right? But and philosophers have talked about it for a long, long time. But I think he's spot on in the sense that one way in which people become lonely is because they lose these spiritual defense mechanisms, including the believing in the God.
I wonder if I can jump in, because what you are saying right now, and this, as you were talking earlier, this made me think about the mystic Saint John of the Cross wrote this book, The Dark Night of the Soul, and in it he talks about his experience, because he believes, or he articulates his feeling direct experiential encounter with God. But he says before that he has this encounter, he experiences profound loneliness, aloneness. This is the image of the dark night. He's sitting there, he's praying, God, where are you? And all he hears is silence. And this goes on, he says, until it's almost unbearable. For him, as soon as he passes this threshold where it's just too unbearable, suddenly he feels God. But of course, he's writing, his writing is interesting. I mean, it's picked up by people, not because everybody experiences that part, but because I think many people do feel that dark night, where even though they may believe in God, they don't feel God's presence. And so this leads me with an interesting question of what do we make of this existential loneliness, where, as you said, you can be lonely in the middle of Manhattan. You could give people money to go to yoga classes or to just go out to the bar and mingle, and they still may not feel any kind of connection. They may not feel presence of God or presence of others, even though they are in a place where they should be primed for that.
So can you say more about the question? Yeah, can you elaborate exactly what you mean by?
So this seems like there's beyond the question of just providing the resources, the human rights component. there is an experience or an existential point where some people may not find that they can bridge that gap. Right? You said the operational definition for loneliness is a mismatch between our expectations and our perception of connection with other people. And of course, that doesn't mean that we're not connected, right? It means you, as I think you said correctly, you could be at Lang Kwai Fong, on a Saturday night or in Wan Chai, just living it up and still feel profoundly lonely. And so is there any sense of needing to address this, or is this just going to be one of those big questions that we let existentialists write about for the next 300 years and never sort out?
No, I think so. I that's exactly my concern. As I would call myself a public health person, right? Actually, I care about the public and their health and their well-being. I think that's one of the challenges. So when you go on, so regardless of the loneliness, the type of loneliness that we are concerned about, right? So it can be the loneliness, the existential loneliness that you're referring to, or other kinds, or more superficial kinds. If you go on websites, self-help websites, and some authors also talk about it, you will see, register for a class, right? Take your dog on a walk. Make your loneliness into solitude, right? So this is why I'm going this quote. And those are definite. Attending to the internal conditions of loneliness definitely can work, right? We know that empirically. And I think individuals do have some responsibility to do something about their loneliness, right? There's no question about it. The question is, where does their responsibility end and societal responsibility takes effect? Meaning the responsibility of society to try and turn these instances that you're describing into instances of solitude, or to prevent those instances altogether, right? And I think that's the challenge, both normatively, as a way for us, for ethicists, to make a case that society should do that, and both practically to advise policymakers how to accomplish that. And I think you have a few solutions. So I can tell you what we are going to do hopefully at HKU. We are thinking about or applying to do research in social prescribing. So where people come to the emergency department, we identify them as lonely, we link them up with religious representatives. So this can be with different faith, depending on the context, or it can be any religious figure. And that religious figure has a role of, again, either mitigating loneliness in some way, either instructing individuals how to turn their moments of loneliness into solitude, right? And I think religion plays a significant part of that, to exactly tell. So, Kierkegaard talks about the tragic hero, to turn lonely individuals into the tragic hero, even, right? To show them how the moments of loneliness can be transformed into moments of solitude. And beyond that, to connect them to other people who feel lonely, and in this way mitigate their loneliness.
So is this like a going to be part of the role of chaplains?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think chaplains, usually in medicine, we tend, especially, as ethicists who are trained in analytic philosophy, we try to shy away from religion and religious stuff. And I think that's a mistake, because religion has such a significant force in people's life, such a significant role we should use that. We should encourage the use of religion or the reliance on religion or religious tools to help you.
Oh, that's part of our school's mission.
There
Christian
you go.
education for
There
the
you
whole
go.
person. Thank you. Yeah, other questions? I don't see any. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have questions about your PowerPoint on the human rights part.
Yeah.
I guess my questions can be divided into two parts. One is just kind of straightforward questions about whether the human right you are talking is more on the moral human right or more on talking about some international legal human right.
Moral.
Yeah.
Moral. I don't talk about legal. I think the legal will come from the moral.
Yeah. Okay. There's
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
it can be a lot of questions, discussions about that, but I also assume you're talking about moral rights, so
Yeah.
sure. And then if it's about moral human rights, then I would like to hear you say more about whether it is or why it is related to the moral human right of health when talking about our loneliness. Because I can so far I can see that what you are saying is telling us it is important as a moral value of being avoiding loneliness in some sense or in some situations. But even they are morally subjective, whether they should be considered to be a moral right to be another issue. I mean, it should be something we find even higher. Especially because when talking about loneliness, yes, usually we don't want to be lonely for a long time. But sometimes we still need to have some time to be alone, whether you report it to that lonely, but at least we need some individual time, something like that. So making loneliness or avoid loneliness as a part of health and then looking to the more human rights. I'm not totally against that, but I want to hear more than just to say it is morally subjective. So I wonder.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So again, so I think as a right to health, well, first of all, what you're concerned about the fact that sometimes we want to be lonely or alone, that's fair enough. You know, having a right doesn't mean that you have a duty yourself. But the fact that you yourself, the individual, has the right doesn't mean you have a duty to yourself. Right? The two are different. And in that sense, you can have a right to something, or again, in this case, against loneliness. At the same time, you don't have a duty to yourself never to be alone. The two are distinguished, and you know, you have a right to be healthy, but you can also choose to be not healthy, right? If you don't exercise, if you smoke. So that goes to that concern. The way to establish that, I think the easiest way to establish a right to against loneliness as a part of a right to health is first to use the notion of social determinants of health, right? Which right now I think, you know, all serious public health people and bioethicists will take for granted. You know, it's not, used to be more controversial, but less so now. And that goes to, you know, basically we know that even more important than access to healthcare, right, to the medication that you take, to the physician that you have, much more important is your sense of personal autonomy, not more autonomy, personal autonomy. So the liberty that you have in your life and the power dynamics that you have with your peers, right, in society. Much more important than anything else in terms of the way it affects your health. And just using loneliness in the sense of, you know, I call it the negative social determinants of health. I think again, it's pretty straightforward to say, you know, you can rely on specific theories. So Norman Daniels, you know, I just happen to like. So you know, he at first he talked about a right to healthcare, but in his latest book he talks about a right to health. understanding the importance of social determinants of health, and you can easily, put the right against loneliness into that. So if you feel lonely, you have reduced opportunities, right? And so in order to get an equality of opportunity, you need to do something about loneliness, right? So that's I think it's a pretty easy, straightforward way. The really more challenging path is to say independently, right, that humans have a right to health or right against loneliness. And I think, again, you have a few ways to do that. One is obviously to prove that empirically, scientifically, that humans are social creatures, right? And some people are doing that. Obviously, it's less convincing for philosophers. This is odd gap. So I'm not pushing that too strongly. But I think addressing the intuition that we all have and that philosophers shared since, at least since Aristotle, is that it goes against what I said before, that your well-being, your humanity, your very essence as a human being depends on your environment, on your social environment, on your social connections. So some authors are talking about identity and the fact that our very identity is determined by our social relations, our social dynamics. So I think psychologists know that we epistemologically, we know ourselves through the eyes of others, right? I think that's pretty common, pretty taken for granted right now. That you know who you are through the eyes of others, right? The way you perceive others to perceive you. But going deeper than that, you define your own identity based on your social dynamics, right? So you have a few authors, just this morning I read Gadamer, who talks about self-alienation, right? And I think the core of the argument is accurate. The challenge is to just elaborate it or articulate it better than what they did. But I think phenomenologically, defining your own identity and in a way being free depends on first of all, depends on you perceiving your own identity or developing your own identity, right? And that identity depends on social relations, right? So once you, again, I'm not establishing this link, but if someone were to establish that link successfully, and I think some came really close, that would be a way to really fundamentally justify this right against loneliness, because it goes deep to your identity. And in order to be free, we need to have an identity of a self against another, right? Which is really interesting because a lot of the accounts of existential loneliness go back to this Hegelian perspective of, the only reason why we are lonely and all of us feel lonely is because at the beginning, at some point in time, we acknowledge that we are separated from others. It can be from our parents, from our friends. And you realize, so it's paradoxical because through others, you realize that you are a self, that you are self-contained, that you are not connected to others, and that makes you feel lonely. And I think the solution or defining the right to loneliness or against loneliness, again, relies on that link between identity and perception of the self and other individuals, right? yeah, I don't know if I have anything here. No, that's it. I have a quote I wanted to add, but next time. So that would be the challenge, or at least that's the challenge for me. A somewhat easier way to do so will be really to go from up to bottom, and this is what Brownlee is doing here. So she says this. She said, humans have a right to a minimally adequate access to decent human contact, right? And again, she justifies it by a minimum condition for well-being, for human well-being. So because humans have a right to well-being, society has the obligation to accommodate that right. That right includes a minimally adequate access to decent human contact. And she doesn't use loneliness, she uses social deprivation, which is close enough. So third level, you have that, that's the way to justify a right against loneliness, right? Because of this right to well-being, because of this right to minimally adequate access to decent human contact, therefore you have a right against social deprivation. So this goes kind of from a big theory to down to the individual right.
What if I can have a follow-up? So in one of your articles, you mentioned the distinction between therapy and enhancement. And this is, of course, an interesting concept within bioethics. For those of you who don't know the difference, or the idea that therapy is establishing something so that you're at what's considered a normative threshold. If you're deaf, for example, we give you hearing aids and then you can hear at the same level as other people. But enhancement gives you the level, the capability at a higher capacity than other people. So super hearing, for example, would be an enhancement. So how do we, if we're talking about loneliness as a human rights and a healthcare concern, is there a possibility for having loneliness enhancement, or being in like a super socialized person, feeling more than adequately connected to other people?
Yeah, so you actually, people in Chicago are developing a loneliness pill.
Loneliness pill.
Yeah. Right. And then you have to ask yourself, wait a minute, is that therapy or is that enhancement? Right? So, you know,
Is that not just ecstasy?
no, actually, it's just the estrogen. So that's-
Estrogen.
yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Apparently, women are better than us in the developing social relations. So, you know, I think it's an interesting question for those who are interested in that kind of question, whether it's therapy or enhancement. I tend to be less interested in that, just because it doesn't really matter to me whether it is enhancement or whether it's therapy. I'm more concerned about, or where I come from is more well-being, or enabling a meaningful life for individuals. So in that sense, I don't really care whether you call it enhancement or therapy. And the reason why I say that, or at least it is at least my way to escape that discussion, because I think the answer is complex, right? So if you take for granted, or if you assume really, if you accept the notion that this notion of existential loneliness, right? That loneliness is a fact of human life, then every therapy against loneliness will be a kind of enhancement, because normalcy. So usually, one way to define the difference between enhancement and therapy is talk about normalcy. So if it's within normal, we talk about therapy. If it's beyond what it is to be normal, then we talk about enhancement, right? So it depends on your philosophical understanding of loneliness. If you understand loneliness existentially, as is it's a fact of life, right? All humans are lonely, and all we do in life is seek ways to escape our loneliness. Then whatever you do against loneliness is enhancement, right? Because loneliness is natural. If your conception is that, on the contrary, that humans are social creatures essentially, so every measure against loneliness you can see as therapy, right? Including a loneliness pill. So that's where I stand. Again, I think from a public health perspective, I don't consider that discussion to be of enormous importance. Personally.
Follow up then. You cited Sherry Turkle in one of your articles as well, and in her book Alone Together, which is perfectly situated for this conversation.
Yeah.
She has this instance where she talks about going to a university and giving a talk about, I believe it was about chatbots or about social robots or something. And she was wringing her hands about how disconcerting this was. And she said afterwards, a student came to her and asked her where she could get one of those. And Sherry Turkle says that she was pretty shocked that this was the takeaway, that there's a solution to this. So how does that fit into this bigger conversation?
Yeah. So, so I am very much in disagreement with Sherry Turkle, and I find her couple of books pretty superficial, and even more than that, pretty paternalistic. So she actually says, talking about social robots, she says that the social robots take away our humanity, the use of social robots, and I disagree. So Sherry, she goes, in her books, she interviews a lot of people, mainly college students and high school students, and she sort of arguing against them, right? So they all use technology, and she's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? This takes away from your humanity." And one reason for that, she says, well, why does it take away our humanity? Because the use of technological measures takes away your ability to empathize with your peers, with other humans. And I think, empirically speaking, that's not accurate. And also conceptually, so there's a really good scholar who argues, no, you can develop, you can enhance, you can accommodate empathy even on Facebook, even using Skype, Zoom, and social robots can increase or express this notion of empathy, right? So I think Sherry tries to capture a common intuition that we may have from the use of technology. And I can show you, if you want, I can show you a short clip of using a social robot. That the reason why I bring them is because I think it stirs up this intuition among us, among philosophers, that something went away, right? And I think Sherry tries to capture that. I don't think her argument is really convincing, right? I think she's biased, and I think she doesn't go deep enough, frankly. But I think it's a genuine attempt to capture the intuition that something that society should not rely on technology to deal with loneliness, right? Society should rely on human beings or members of the community to help others who are lonely, right? And again, I think her notion that it takes away our humanity is not quite there, and the notion, the specific argument that you cannot show empathy online is also inaccurate. Yeah. I don't know. You want to see a short clip? Do we have time for that?
We have a 25 minutes, so
Okay.
sure.
So there are a bunch of videos here. Let me start maybe with the, I will show you two clips. One is, I think that you will find acceptable. Yeah, I think. Ah,
But you can share this.
can they show that? Can they see that? So LEQ, that's an Israeli company that produces social robots, the robot that you saw. So NYC just acquired robots from them, 850, to give to the elderly. So you can say that clip, you'll think about giving social robots to people who are only doing COVID and future pandemics. I think that video is, seems okay. It's not alarming too much, but it gets worse, right? And these are clips you can find on YouTube. The company obviously uses them to promote their product. I will go to the other extreme, right? There are other clips in between. We can watch them if you want, but this is, I think, the extreme, and this is what really, again, motivate my work on they couldn't see the.
They could see, but they couldn't hear.
Oh, all right. I didn't know you can do that. So this really motivated my work on the article that I sent, and some more recent work.
Nobody prepared me for getting older. And because I live alone, I thought having a companion would be wonderful for me. She checks up on me. She finds out how I'm doing. She remembers little things like, I wasn't happy yesterday. How am I feeling today? She even knows where I'm sitting or standing, and she looks at me. She's perfect. Do you know I love you? Yes, I love you.
Right? So that's pretty scary stuff, right? And so in the paper that I sent around, I don't know if you got it, I was kind of arguing against bodies, so international and national bodies that use technology, solely technology, to mitigate or prevent loneliness, right? In this more recent work, I focus on the internal conditions of loneliness. And what I want to say to those people, that person who loves the robot, that you really should stop, right? That your love is not praiseworthy, right? It's inappropriate. And obviously that's a significant philosophical challenge to do that. The two examples that I bring here by two, Sherry and another philosopher in Australia, they try to do that and they fail, I think, for various reasons, and we can go deeper into that. But basically, one of the ways in which they fail is what we call hard paternalism or strong paternalism. So they, in reality, they say to those folks what their end should be, right? So, to the woman who loves her robot, they want to say your subject of love should not be robots, right? It should be humans. And I think that risks being hard paternalism, and usually in bioethics, we think that hard paternalism, except really rare circumstances, hard paternalism is unjustified. What I'm trying to do is still tell those folks, no, you really should stop having those feelings. You should direct your feelings towards humans rather than robots. And I think a way to do that, why not being a paternalist, is by revising the notion of loneliness. That goes back to philosophical definitions of loneliness. So there are two contemporary philosophers, philosophers of mind, who present this notion, articulate this concept of loneliness as absence. So in their account is, so you have a twofold mechanism of loneliness or physiology of loneliness. One is, the first one is you develop a pro attitude towards something, in this case, towards social relations. And that social relations give you, or being part of that social relations, give you access to some social goods, right? The ability to contribute to society, the ability to receive something, love, affection, companionship, etc., etc. I think you need to go. You need to go? No? Seem restless. So those social relations give you access to social goods. So that's the first level. The second level is you recognize, you acknowledge the absence of that something, right? You acknowledge, you realize that something is missing from your life. And that, if we accept that definition of loneliness, which is a more nuanced, deeper understanding definition of loneliness than the operational definition, then we can tell those people what you really have a pro attitude towards is human connections, not the ability to talk with something, right? With an object. And the social goods you're looking for are not, again, the ability to communicate with the robot. So the robot can actually put your image in other location. So puts a picture of Paris and puts your picture against that in the background, and then you can send that picture to your family if you want, right? As you took a trip to Paris. I think using the definition of loneliness as absence, you can tell those people, without being paternalistic, your true end, you think they might be the social robots, but they are not. Your true end are conversing, touching, sharing spiritual moments with fellow human beings, whether family, intimate relations, what have you. And the robots can be helpful until, again, substituting human relations until you get them, right? But they cannot be the ultimate solution to your need, right? Because your need is not the connection with the robot, is connection with human being. Thank you. Oh, yes, good questions.
That's fine.
Yeah, please.
We're about to end, so let me ask two more questions.
Sure.
Maybe I would still plan for I mean something like that. What is the difference between having a robot to be a companion and having a dog or a cat to be a companion? Like, is it that you mentioned that we should not talk to something? So is that pet, is that something? Like, it seems that to me it's different to have a robot to be your companion. There is a difference between these two. And the second thing is that about the loneliness is that we can only solve the problem with human being, or if we can communicate with other species, for example, so pets is one of them, and the second one is maybe some of the trainers, maybe with dolphins that have some like they have IQ and then they can communicate with you. Is it that is another solution rather than being with humans? So this is two questions.
Yeah, I think that's An amazing question. Those two ways to answer that. One is more simple. The first one is empirically, we know that pets help. Right, so I'm a strong believer in that approach. So you provide help. We even know virtual interactions with pets. They use that. There's a small trial during COVID that they use virtual communications with pets to help the elderly. And the elderly said, "Oh yeah, that helped us." Right? So that's crazy to me. So I think empirically that helps. Right? So that's one way. We don't know about that with robots. We have all this anecdotal evidence. I don't know any trials that actually show that robots reduce loneliness. We know that in pets. Okay. So that's one. Second, so you're talking about the conceptual, theoretical difference between robots and animals. So we be pets like dogs or dolphins or more advanced animals, more intelligent. That's a very good question. Well, first of all, I'm biased because I'm much a stronger believer in the power of animals to reduce loneliness. So I have to account for that. I have to be honest about that. My intuitive response would be touch. That it's much more significant to share touch with animals than it is with robots. But then a reply could be, wait a minute, but then you have the Japanese robot, or you have a few other kinds of robots that it's actually nice to touch them. They have fur and they wag their tail. And you actually, if you go to YouTube, you have patients with dementia and they were given the social robots to pet, and that's what they do. We don't know if it helps them, but you know, they do have that experience of touching. So that might be go against my argument, or against this intuition. A second response to that, and again, this is not, I'm just thinking together with you. A second response will be some authors, including Brownlee, talk about loneliness and social deprivation. The problem with it is that they take away your ability to contribute to society, to contribute to something. So the fact that you are lonely or socially isolated means that you cannot take care of someone, right? And they want to argue that, again, being humans essentially means that you want to be cared for, but you also want to care for others, right? And being unable to do that also can create to make you lonely. And if that is true, then you can use that argument, or you can rely on that to say, you need to take care of pets, you need to take care of animals, but you don't really need to take care of computers or robots. And again, this is one argument that Sparrow is making. I think it's somewhat convincing, not wholly, but that would be my response. But I think it's a perfect question, and I think it deserves much more attention.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, but so I knew that you seem restless. That's okay. Gigi?
Yeah. So I thought I missed something there. I think you first criticized one criticism of using social robots for care as being strongly capitalistic. Did I miss it? That's what you said.
Yeah.
And later you developed an argument which sounded to me also capitalistic. So I don't know if that impression is fair, because you said something like, you by revising or defining what loneliness is, we can somehow tell people that what they really need. So what makes that less capitalistic, or at least less viciously?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good. So in bioethics, we distinguish between strong paternalism and weak paternalism, or soft paternalism, right? So in soft paternalism, you direct the patient in this case, or the individual, to use other means, or you argue about the means to reach an end that you both agree on, right? Whereas in strong paternalism, you argue about the ends. So in clinical medicine, you know, if a patient now comes to me and say, I want to use antibiotics for influenza because I want to get healthy, so my end is to be healthy, I will tell them, no, dude, you're not getting antibiotics because it's not going to help you. So I disagree with the means to achieve the end, which is being healthy, right? And that's soft paternalism, that's usually accepted in medical ethics. So I just assume that to be true. Strong paternalism is where I will tell the patient, no, I won't give you antibiotics because I disagree that you should be healthy, right? What I'm hoping to achieve with a revision of this concept, definition of loneliness, is a way to, first of all, capture the intuition that I think we all, or a lot of people in this room or listening, share, that something is wrong with those images, with the clip that we saw, that people rely too much on the social robots. Why not being strong paternalist? I'm not sure I'm successful, but that's my attempt. And again, so just to recapitulate, what I'm doing is trying to do is to reestablish the means, re-articulating what the real me or real ends of people are, right? So those people who we saw, I'm assuming those that they believe that the end of what they need, right, to be healthy, to be less lonely, is communicating with social robots. Maybe they didn't believe that before, but they got adjusted because, you know, that's what they have. Some of them don't have families. Some of them don't have their families visiting them. What they have is social robots. In a way, they adjust to that situation, and they adjust their expectations. So this is going back to the inadequacy of the operational definition of loneliness. It allows those people to say, and policymakers to say, look, I mean, we are fine with just throwing social robots on people because that's what they expect. They adjusted their expectations to just have relations with robots. Therefore, that's what we are giving them. It's all fine. And so the end becomes, you know, the lack of, or the end becomes having relations with robots, right? Or rather, no, the end becomes being not lonely. The means is through relations with robots. What I want to say is, right, so the end, I agree. The end is not to be lonely, reduce your loneliness, prevent your loneliness. The means are not using robots, right? You got used to it, but that's not what you initially had a pro attitude towards. That's not what you are missing. What you are missing and what you originally had a pro attitude, we are all born with a pro attitude towards relations with other humans. So the means to achieve that end of lack of reduced loneliness is by way of social or human relations rather than the relations with robots. So again, I'm not sure this is convincing, but that's my attempt to kind of evade this charge of strong paternalism.
Yeah, thanks. That helps. Yeah. So in this case, you mean that Sherry Turkle she's saying that they don't even have the right ends, not just the right,
exactly,
not just the means
exactly,
are wrong,
exactly. So both Sparrow and Sherry, they are saying. So in Sherry's case, she has a few arguments, right? So I mentioned one. it goes against humanity. The use of social robots. What is humanity? I mean, come on. Second, well, what is humanity in health? Right? Second, you said there's no empathy, right? Or through so in the relation where you have social robots. The charge of strong paternalism applies to her more significantly when she talks about privacy. So one of the concerns is if you put social robots in people's houses, you deprive them of their privacy. Because indeed, these social robots, make no mistake about it, they gather so much data, right? And make no question about it, or make no doubt about it, the companies that make the robots are going to use that data, and they are going to sell that data for a lot of money. Right? So that's a valid concern. However, what Cherry does, or seems to argue, is that the need to maintain privacy is more important, or should be more important for people than dealing with their loneliness. And that is, I think, that is why we can charge her, we can blame her for strong paternalism. The notion about humanism, we can just say she's sloppy, less strong paternalism.
Interesting. Thank you.
So very quickly, what do you think of the view that some people have the view that using social robots somewhere involves some kind of deception when people like in the advertising video, right? They seem to develop emotional attachment.
Yeah.
Which I mean could be self-deception actually, right? Really take the other one, have emotional states or even emotional responses when the robot, as we know currently, they at best only appear to have emotional response, but they're not really have any. So is that a problem? Is that all one of the problems?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. That's exactly the main argument by Sparrow, and he says this here and in other articles, one that he wrote with his mother. So this is a philosopher from Australia in Melbourne, and he wrote about a lot AI.
We should actually give several talks here.
Yeah. So he says that. He says exactly that we have a duty to ourselves to live in reality the way it is, capture reality the way it is, right? And his main concern is that we deceive ourselves in our relations to social robots, right? So she was talking about the recent clip was talking about how she loves the robot. Another clip talks about that the robot is the best friend that she ever had, right? And Sparrow would say, no, they deceive themselves, and they have a duty to not deceive themselves. First of all, I think it was, well, I think I will join, in that regard, I will join another philosopher, Australian philosopher by the name of Russell, who argues against Sparrow. And he says, but we deceive ourselves. There might be a duty to ourselves to capture reality the way it is, but it's not an absolute duty, right? There are other overriding duties or needs, such as the need to be happy, to be content, and to maintain our well-being. And he says, throughout our lives, we deceive ourselves all the time, right? Think about love.
It's really cynical.
Many instances of love involve self-deception, right? Especially when it's non-reciprocal. Think about when you submit a paper for publication, right? Among the faculty of us, you think it's the best paper ever written, right? But you have to deceive yourself that way, otherwise you won't submit it, right? You will procrastinate for the rest of your life, right? So
you only submit. You only submit.
no, but in order to teach philosophy, in order to be a scholar and to be an independent scholar, there is a sense of what I'm doing. My research is important, can change lives, right? Can better the lives of people, and we know most of the time it's not going to. So self-deception is a critical part of our lives in everything we do. And authors are talking about self-deception as it's a way for actually one of the psychological consequences of loneliness is the fact that you see reality more accurately than if you're not lonely, right? So you become much more sensitive about social cues, and you realize that you are not so special or you're not as good as you thought you are, right? And psychologists talk about the negative implication of that, right? Even though it's probably true that you're not as good as you think you are, all of us, and loneliness makes you realize that, but psychologically speaking, it reduces your well-being. So one condition for well-being is, to have some degree of self-deception. So I think in that regard, because of that, this notion, this argument of the duty to ourselves to be against self-deception and to capture reality the way it is, really fails. At best, even if you have a duty to yourself, which is controversial, this notion in general of duty to ourselves, it's still, they are not absolute. And you have other overriding duties or needs or rights.
Thank you.
All right, well, it is 4 o'clock. This is a very stimulating discussion, but I think if there's no other questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Lederman. This is a very fascinating discussion. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what do I do? Stop share?
Yeah, you can hit stop.